Welcome once again to Heart of a Shepherd. I invite you to open your Bible with me to 1 Chronicles chapter 26. 1 Chronicles chapter 26, the title, What Kind of Man Does God Call to Serve Him and His People? I invite you to open your Bible, 1 Chronicles chapter 26. Well, I've enjoyed our study here at Valley Forge. It does come to a conclusion for today, and I'll certainly miss this beautiful place. And I appreciate you, whether it's the poor lighting or maybe the wind blowing, that you've still honored the Lord by following through with me in our study. Well, 1 Chronicles 26, I invite you to consider what we will describe as the porters. Now, we find that David's census of the Levites continued in 1 Chronicles 26, listing men and families who would serve as the porters of the temple. 1 Chronicles 26. Now, also remind you, we've looked at this before in 1 Chronicles chapter 9. Now, what is a porter? Well, the porter, in effect, is a gatekeeper, or the ancient equivalent of what churches today would call a security team. Absolutely. Now, how significant were the porters? Well, first of all, they were members of the tribe of Levi. Now, God had chosen the tribe of Levi to serve Him. And here these porters are serving the Lord on behalf of Israel. They are the guards. They are the gatekeepers to the entrances to the temple grounds, and their challenge was to remain alert against thieves and enemies. Now, we find that these were exceptional men who took their responsibilities just as seriously as the priests did. In fact, you'll notice the description of these men, 1 Chronicles 26 and verse 6, they're described as mighty men of valor. In verse 7, they are strong men. In verse 8, they are able men. Now, they were assigned by family to different gates, verses 13 through 19. And you'll notice that altogether, these porters, these guards, if you would, of the gate, were from 24 different companies. Now, not only do we have the porters, but in verses 20 through 28, we have the treasurers and storekeepers or guards. Now, because guarding the temple, or besides guarding the temple, some Levite families also kept the temple treasuries. Now, these families were responsible for protecting the treasures of the house of God. And we find in verse 20 that they watched over the dedicated things. You see, their job was to guard the offerings of the people, but also the spoils that had been won in war, verse 20. Now, in verse 27, the treasuries of the temple were also used to support the house of the Lord. So now we've had the porters, we've had the guards, and now we come to the administrators, and they are named in verses 29 through 32. Again, all of these are Levites. They're from the Levite family, now, or a Levite tribe. Now, a third group of the Levite families managed, verse 29, and I quote, the outward business over Israel, and were officers and judges. Now, by outward business, we understand it involved governing the land outside the temple. Now, they served as legal counselors to the king and his officials. And again, they're described in verse 30 as men of valor in the service of the king. Now, we find some were assigned to tribes west of the Jordan River. They're named in verse 30. Others served the tribes on the east side of the Jordan. They're named in verse 32. Now, the responsibility then of these administrators included a sacred trust. We read in verse 32, for every matter pertaining to God and affairs of the king. Well, a closing thought. Today's brief Bible study concludes with my invitation for you to examine the qualities of the men from the tribe of Levi who were assigned to guard the temple entrances, secure the temple treasuries, and oversee judicial responsibilities. Let's begin by noticing the leadership over God's business was held by men. However, they were not just any men, they were mighty men of valor, strong men, able men, and had the strength for the service. Now, among those wise counselors in verse 14, we also have those who could be trusted and were over the treasures of the house of the Lord, verse 22. And then finally, God's created order is a point of this matter of God choosing men to lead His people. I would remind you that God's created order is that men should rule not only their households, but also His church. For instance, we find in 1 Timothy 3 that pastors and deacons are to be men, the husband of one wife. They are, Ephesians 5, to love their wives, and the wife is to reverence her husband. The same is repeated in Paul's epistle to Titus, where the apostle instructs that the elders or the pastors of the churches are to be the husband of one wife. By the way, and the aged women are to teach the young women to love their husbands, Titus 2, verses 3 and 4. You know, as I close, the 21st century church needs men of character who are courageous, strong, and ready to serve. Somebody might say, well, I'm just a greeter, I just open the doors of the church and invite people in. Listen, my friend, historically, that was a sacred duty given to the tribe of Levi. Don't take it for granted. Cherish it as not only a service to God's people, but to the Lord Himself. God bless, and bye-bye.